Thank you. I was going to comment on the old friends in the room, but politically I've been cautioned over the years. You refer to people like Maury Amate as friends of long standing. There you go. That's the political thing. I appreciate some former staff. I now in the private sector realize even more than I did as a member how critical staff is to one's success. Without that staff now, I'm not nearly as successful as I think I perhaps used to be as a member of Congress. And I especially appreciate the attendance here of those of you who are staffing members of Congress. I hope that what I say today and the commentary that we'll engage in here will assist you and your bosses as you go forward in helping them develop policy as well. Frank goes back to a time that is very meaningful to me. When I retired from the Senate, people frequently asked, well, what was your biggest success? And I said, there are all kinds of successes. It depends on whether you're measuring something useful to Arizona or the national scene, whether it's a domestic issue or foreign. But I said, probably the thing that sticks out most in my mind because of the difficulty of it, because of the importance of it, and because of the outcome, was actually a negative success, keeping something from happening, and that is the adoption of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. That's the first opportunity that Frank and I had to work together in a really difficult and long-term proposition. We met, I don't know how many times, to devise strategy, and then worked up the arguments, got the experts that could help, and made just numerous visits with colleagues. And I still treat it as one of the biggest compliments. One of my colleagues, former colleagues who's still in the Senate, and not someone who always voted with the Republicans, has said to me many times, thank you for convincing me to vote against the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. If you hadn't talked to me, I would have voted for it. And knowing, therefore, that you can make a difference in this, and this is why I referred to those of you who are staffing members, you staff and your members can make a huge difference in the future of the country. It may seem like a tough task to defeat something or to get something passed at the beginning of the effort, but if you work at it in a concerted way and you've got right, truth, and justice on your side, there's no telling, and you've got Frank Gaffney on your side, no telling what you can accomplish. So I, too, think of that particular example when I think of what's going on with the Iranian deal right now. And I will close my remarks by specifically talking about that. But I first wanted to just survey the situation generally to put all of this in perspective. Frank asked the question, well, what about our national security policy today? And I would start out with the proposition that it ought to be crystal clear that we need a different national security policy. What the administration has been doing obviously has not worked. No aspect of U.S. policy is making either America or the world a more peaceful or secure place. Just follow it through with just a few examples that I think are important for us to recall because they help inform how we should be moving forward today. The Russian reset. I can still see the picture of Hillary Clinton with Sergei Lavrov, and of course they got the Russian wrong to begin with, but I forgot what the Russian saying really said. But the bottom line is
overcharge.
Overcharge, and yeah, and the Russian reset button was pushed, and of course everything got worse after that. They oppose us on virtually everything we do. If there's an opportunity to kick us in the shins, they do it. They've threatened the use of nuclear weapons. They've now announced a big new anti-satellite weapon that will blind us in the event of war. They've decided that they are, in fact, going to use tactical nuclear weapons if it suits their purposes. They've invaded and threatened their neighbors, and you know all the rest of it. So the reset has been a colossal failure. The Chinese. We seem to be powerless in dealing with the Chinese, whether it's the assertion of their territorial power or in dealing with direct attacks on the United States in the form of cyber warfare, both to steal from us and also to hurt us. Our allies, they basically have learned to ignore us. The Europeans, certainly Israel, even a country like Egypt, which could be a very strong supporter of U.S. policy, we tend to shun. Our opponents, of course, don't fear us anymore. Our own hemisphere is a mess, if you really want to get into some specifics. And to the issue of the terrorists, obviously, They're feasting on our withdrawal from places like Iraq and soon to be Afghanistan. In terms of U.S. preparedness, a key component of national security policy, it underlies everything. We are vastly weakened in virtually, well, I can't think of a front in which we are not weakened in terms of our force structure, the announcement of bringing the Army down even more. We're already aware of the status of the Air Force and the Navy and so on. All of these things make us far less capable of reacting to problems, let alone helping to set the stage in the first place. The sequester, which was Jack Lew's idea, very quickly sponsored by Barack Obama and unfortunately agreed to by Republican leadership, has resulted in a straitjacket in terms of how we can help fix the problem of our defense preparedness. Our intelligence capability has been greatly weakened by recent legislation and by actions of the administration. From a strategic standpoint, we locked in some pretty important requirements for the administration to meet with respect to our strategic nuclear deterrent and the triad, and more or less those are moving forward, but not because the administration has its heart in it, but because they pretty much have to comply with what we agreed to. Missile defense, doing everything they can to continue to bring that down and fail to move forward on capabilities that could have made us much stronger and could in the future. In space, of course, it remains off limits for only the United States. The Chinese are very active in space, but we wouldn't want to militarize space. Never mind what an ICBM is called as it goes flying through space at 17,000 miles an hour. We wouldn't want to possibly use space for military purposes. And I conclude with cyber. We are capable in the cyber area. We have very smart people who could do some really good things, but we seem to be totally paralyzed in terms of national policy on either dealing with the defensive aspects of it or the deterrent component of cyber, which could be a big factor there if we ever made up our mind to do it. I'm recalling when I think of the sorry state of our military preparedness, and again, this is the fundamental underlying feature of any strong national security policy. You've got to have the strength to back up what you say. I'm reminded of Dick Cheney's comments more than once, thanking the Reagan administration when, as Secretary of Defense, we were able to win the first Gulf War with alacrity and without much in the way of casualties. He thanked them for the weaponry that he had at his disposal to conduct that campaign. It illustrates how long it takes to create the kind of military that you need, and it will also, I think, serve as a warning that to the degree that we are now becoming more and more hollow, it's going to take us just that much longer to rebuild, and that much longer, therefore, to have a foreign policy that can effectively count on having a strong defense component to it. When I think of the Obama legacy, and it seems incomprehensible, but I can see the coonskin on the wall. Well, I tried to have better relationships with Russia and Cuba and Iran. Whoopee. And of course, all the time dissing our friends Canada, Israel, Great Britain, and so on. What a legacy. None of this has worked out well, and that states the obvious. So, yes, we need a different foreign policy. Let me get specific about two things now. The terrorist threat and Iran. The terrorist threat, of course, comes not just from ISIS or ISIL or Daesh or simply the JV team, depending on how you want to define it. But it also includes, of course, Al-Qaeda. Don't forget them. The proxies of Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas and others. And the president says, well, only ideas will defeat these terrorists, not weapons. And of course, that's palpably wrong. He is right that you need ideas to defeat ideas, but of course, he is wrong in assuming that that is the way in which it's done, that weaponry and military force have no place to play here. Guns beat Nazism, and our military preparedness helped us to defeat communism. These are historical facts. So the president is simply wrong. And the idea of ISIS as inevitably succeeding being the great recruiting tool that it is obviously confronted and defeated with overwhelming military force that begins to defeat them. When the inevitability of victory is shattered by defeat, the ideology begins to shatter as well, because the ideology is premised on the notion that Allah is on their side and will only assure victory. When that doesn't happen, fairly smart people begin to ask questions. So there is a way to use military force to help defeat terrorism. It is also true, of course, that particularly in the Muslim community, people have to step up and play a role in defining the appropriate practice of Islam and exclude the radical Islam that focuses on terrorism. There are other things, obviously, to talk about here. You can't talk about Hezbollah and Hamas, for example, without talking about Iran, and that is a segue to quickly move into discussion of Iran. And then what I want to do is open this up for your comments and questions. But I do think we should spend a minute on Iran because of the centrality of the threat of Iran to world peace, to instability in the region, to support for terrorism, and to its role in proliferation of nuclear weaponry. Because if nothing else comes out of all of these negotiations, it is clear that starting with countries in the Middle East, there will be proliferation of nuclear weaponry, exactly the opposite of what President Obama has always been for, because of his feckless policies, because of the fact that these countries will appreciate that if Iran is going to have the weapon, they're going to have it too. And all that will do is foster more rather than fewer countries with the weaponry. As most in this room, I'm sure, would agree, the whole Obama approach to Iran is founded on a fundamental fallacy, a deeply flawed understanding of what can be achieved through his wonderful diplomacy with a regime which is fundamentally committed to something totally different. You can't talk them out of their fundamental belief, and their fundamental belief includes hegemony in the area, eradication of the state of Israel, and as much in the way of a promotion of their ideology abroad, the ideology of political Islam, as they can possibly get away with, which is absolutely contradictory to everything Western and certainly to the policy that the United States would like to pursue with respect to international order and the control of international events. The whole notion that you can make concessions to the Ayatollah and he will therefore bend your way on fundamental principles that undergird his goals and objectives in Iran is terribly flawed. But that is the president's view of things. He has, I mean, people have said the president is arrogant, that he is very self-centered, that he has an overblown view of his own capabilities and so on. Well, all of that may be true. Put it in this context, and it becomes extraordinarily dangerous. But to have the hubris that you, because of your wonderful skills at communicating, can divine the way to cause people who are fundamental believers in something to abandon those beliefs is folly. And that's why, among other things, it takes a military component. But it's also why the whole approach of the president to Iran is flawed and dangerous. And one of the elements that gets to is this whole notion of the nuclear negotiations. But it also, of course, pertains to Iran's support for terrorism and all the rest. The problem is here that many, many people will pay a very heavy price to prove the administration wrong. And that obviously is also true for the attempt to disconnect terrorism and the other bad actions of Iran from the nuclear negotiations. But let's just focus on them for a moment. Frank and others have written a very good document outlining 9 key points that should be the fundamental components of an agreement with Iran. I'd like to focus less on those details, though, than an overriding concern, and this takes me back to the CTBT and to arms control agreements generally. I think we make a mistake, and I'm addressing this now to friends in the conservative strong national security community here. We make a mistake in chasing too many rabbits, in talking about the things the other side wants to talk about. One of their favorite things to talk about, because they know they have to, is verification. Well, it can be verified. So what? It can't. And we should debate that. These arms control agreements can never be properly verified. And this agreement won't be verifiable. But they will insist that there are bells and whistles to make it verifiable. So what? What comes after verification? Enforcement. If you can't enforce the agreement, if you can't hold the other side accountable, if you can't get the other side to change its behavior to abide by the agreement, then nothing else matters. And this agreement is per se unenforceable. We're not dealing with Company A and Company B negotiating terms of a contract and having a dispute about whether the appropriate dispute resolution mechanism should be arbitration or litigation in the jurisdiction of the District of Columbia. That's not what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a country whose policy is premised on violation of anything that it agrees to when it suits its purpose to violate it, because it has a fundamental goal, and nothing is going to keep them from achieving that goal. The negotiation process, and maybe even some temporary accommodations, are all designed as a way to help get to that goal. We represent some roadblocks. We represent some detours. And that's inconvenient for the Iranians. They would just as soon be able to go straight to the development of a weapon. But they acknowledge that they're not in the driver's seat totally here. And they're going to have to zigzag, and they're going to have to back up and go around, and sometimes back off a little bit, in order to keep the West generally, these countries with whom they're negotiating and the international bodies, to keep them at bay long enough until they can get the weapon. That's the idea. So to some extent, they may have to agree to something from time to time. But they have no intention whatsoever of allowing any of that to get in their way to completing the mission. They may comply with some terms for some time. That may suit their purpose. It may not matter that much to them. But in the long run, they'll do what they have to do. So it doesn't matter what you have in here with regard to terms and conditions and verifications if it can't be enforced. Now, why do I say it can't be enforced? Look at the arms control agreements with the Soviet Union and Russia. They're in violation of arms control agreements today. Can we get them to agree? No. Why? Because they don't want to. How do you make them? What do you do? Well, it's a pretty weak read, but we've finally fallen back on the notion that we'll invoke sanctions. Well, of course, what we call sanctions would perhaps be compared to pinpricks in some of these situations. But even there, they're very difficult to enforce, and when you're dealing with other countries and international bodies, they're almost impossible to enforce. Why? Well, first of all, think about the Iranian situation. In order to begin the process of enforcement of the agreement, because of an alleged violation, you have to define and prove the violation. How do you do that? Well, first of all, it requires the disclosure of a lot of very highly classified information. We're the only ones who are going to find out what somebody's doing that's wrong. The IAEA gets most of, and I shouldn't say that, the IAEA relies to some degree on U.S. intelligence, which is perfectly appropriate. Our intelligence is going to be what provides the evidence of a violation, if we can come up with it. A lot of this is very, very difficult to come up with. So verification is not unimportant. Please don't read my comments to suggest that. It's very difficult. It's hard. But even if we think we've got it, taking it to the next step of proving to the people who have to be convinced to enforce it with inconvenient things to do becomes very, very difficult. First, you have to decide what you're going to share in terms of classified information. That becomes a huge, huge problem, particularly when you're dealing with people like the Russians and the Chinese and so on, and international bodies, including the UN. But even when you sit down in a closed room and you show your stuff and they are convinced, okay, it looks like they're violating the agreement. Now what? Well, now all of the different elements of international politics come into play. Do the Russians feel like cooperating with us at the moment? Or might this represent another opportunity to kick us in the shins? Well, almost by definition, you know the answer to that at any given time. The Chinese, same thing. I mean, our big thing with the Chinese is, well, we can never enforce anything against the Chinese because we always have more things to ask of them. We have so many irons in the fire. We've got all this economic stuff going on, all these other things. And if we rag on them here, they're going to push back over there. We want them to stop the cyber attacks, so we can't be too tough on them to try to get to impose sanctions on the Iranians, and so on and so on. It becomes very, very difficult. Of course, we can count on our European friends to back us on sanctions, no problem there. Their businesses and industries are very happy to cooperate by sacrificing some profits that they could otherwise make by dealing with the Iranians. So that's not a big issue. You've got the fact that deals are already made. In other words, when the president talks about snapback, there is no such thing as snapback. A deal once made is made. You can't undo it. And by the way, these agreements don't provide for the undoing of agreements that were entered into at the time legally, sanctions-free. So that has to play out, however long it is, and whatever the terms of it are. But there are simply too many commercial interests involved for very many of these countries to be very forward-leaning in supporting the United States in something like the Iranian nuclear deal. And especially when we've been so feckless in the conduct of our foreign policy to hack everybody off who otherwise might be a friend. So there are a lot of reasons why these agreements are very, very difficult to enforce, even if they're verifiable. And it's something that we just don't discuss very often because it's hard. And I suggest that when we evaluate whatever proposal comes out, if in fact there is a deal made, that instead of focusing on is it 3 months or is it 2 months and 3 weeks, focus on the bottom line. Can this ever be enforced? And I think the answer will be no. Now, you all know the process here. And I'm not going to get into all of that, but it is very critical to appreciate the fact that if there is an agreement, it can probably be defeated, but there'll be a veto, and that's going to have to be overridden. So the big political question is, how do you then get the votes to override the veto, to provide the reverse of what a treaty requires, that is to say a 2/3 approval, which is what, a 1/3 approval and a 2/3 disapproval, which would be what's required here. I have one suggestion, and that is to take the president's formulation of this as, well, either you agree with my deal or it's war. You know, are you for war? We all know that's the president's favorite formulation, the false choice. He is, of course, ensuring that choice is maybe not so false by having taken force off the table to begin with. I mean, he ostensibly says it's on the table, but then he says, well, which would you rather have, this deal or war? Nobody wants war. Does anybody think we're going to have war at any point? Not with this administration. So he's essentially taken it off the table. Well, what does that leave? We're relegated to arguing that, well, maybe sanctions would still work. Now, of course, under a different administration, with a different kind of military, and working with our allies, military action could theoretically be an element that would respond to a violation. But it's hard. So you are relegated to talking seriously about sanctions. And I think one of the ways to approach the sanctions question about how, well, maybe we could make it work somewhat, sort of, is to reorient the nature of the sanctions. What's going on in Iran today? At least we read more and more of a disaffected citizenry, particularly younger people, who had nothing to do with the revolution. They were born after that time. They're all into social media. Yes, they live under the thumb of a repressive regime, but these are people that don't care that much about politics. They don't care much about the nuclear weapon. In fact, I suppose if you ask the man on the street or woman on the street in Iran, well, you couldn't ask the woman on the street, sorry. But the people would say, oh yeah, it'd be kind of cool to have a nuclear weapon. We could be like other big powers. That would make us proud. So I think what we need to do is appreciate the fact that sanctions designed to change behavior are never going to by themselves change the behavior of the Iranian regime, which will sacrifice virtually everything to stay in power, including the poverty or the wealth of its own people and their happiness. So I think instead what we have to do is to focus on the message that we're sending with our sanctions. We've got it all wrong. We're basically telling the hapless Iranian people, bear with us on this. We're going to make you suffer like hell in order to get your government to back off the development of a nuclear weapon, which would be to our advantage. Wouldn't it be better to say to them, we're going to help you achieve the degree of freedom and independence and autonomy that you would like to have, to develop an economy, to be free to say what you want to say, to live your life in happiness, by trying to pressure your government to let go of some of the power that it's exercising. Now that's a message that might resonate with people who are being asked to suffer a lot. At least they wouldn't have the sense that the Americans are punishing us for something we never did. So we don't like that, therefore we don't like the Americans. Rather, if the message is, hey, the Americans are trying to help us here. They're trying to help us gain more authority with respect to our government. Well, maybe then there's a counter-pressure for the Ayatollahs and their ilk in power. Because it's not just that their economy is suffering and they don't have the money to buy all of this stuff and to build weapons and so on, but rather that their people are becoming more and more restive because they're being hurt economically, not because of the fault of the West, but because of the fault of the Iranian leaders, because they won't give the people the freedom that the American leaders would like to see them get. Now, it's always a little bit dangerous for the United States to have the hubris to think that we can change every other country into a democracy. We can't. But our value system ought to inform what we do. And if we really believe, as we do, that most people would like to be free, why not take advantage of that fact of life in reversing the opprobrium with respect to these sanctions, so that the Iranian people, instead of being mad at us because they're suffering from our sanctions, get to be mad at their leaders because their leaders won't be more cooperative with their people. As long as this is about our goals, for our benefit, for the country of Iran not to have a nuclear weapon, most of the people couldn't care less about that. Or if they do, they're kind of proud they're going to have a weapon. It doesn't help them any, and it hurts them a lot with the sanctions. So I just would offer up that we need to sometimes think about the way that we sell our message. We have dropped all of the great public diplomacy that we used to engage in, the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the Endowment for Democracy. All these things now have taken a second seat under the Obama administration. They were critical during the Cold War and in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. In this regard, the president has a kernel of truth. Ideology can affect ideology. Truth, news, all of these things can affect people's behavior. And if we could reach out to the Iranian people at the same time that we're squeezing the heck out of their economy, we might have an opportunity to put the kind of pressure on the Ayatollahs that would actually have some result. But if we don't do that, then sanctions to me seem an almost impossible solution. And if we can't argue that sanctions have a potential effect, then we're left without much in the way of argument except trying to bomb them to hell. And that's not going to work, at least in the long run, and most people don't want to do it. So, food for thought, and position that there's a lot wrong with our foreign policy. It's got to change. I've got a whole list of things here that I would do differently. I suspect we can all agree on those 9 points, and we don't need to get into them. But it starts with this. It does start with this. If we do not reconstitute our military, and if we do not pay attention to the kind of capabilities we're going to need in the future, we're not going to have the ability to back up a robust foreign policy. And if we're going to set the table rather than constantly being reactive to events, we're going to have to not only think ahead and work the world, but also have the capability to back up what we say. And, of course, the willpower to use that capability if we ever need it. So, your thoughts and comments, questions?
If I could ask the first question, please. Senator, one of the things... That's right. I paid for this microphone, as they say. Just a codicil to what you said about Dick Cheney's thanking his predecessor. He, I think, more recently observed that no one was going to thank Barack Obama for what he has bequeathed to his successors. In your litany of reasons to be concerned about the Iranians, I was struck by the fact that you didn't explicitly mention the threat that this regime poses to the United States itself, which it insensibly says it in hopes will meet an early demise. One of the things that I've always admired about you is the focus that you've paid on the whole nuclear environment, the threat particularly that has been posed to us in the past but is now emerging as we speak. And one aspect of it that has not been widely discussed in the context of Iran, except, interestingly enough, by your former colleague from Arizona, Trent Franks, is the danger that the Iranians seem to have put into place, with the possible exception of a nuclear weapon, all the capabilities that are needed for an electromagnetic pulse attack against the grid of the United States. Trent has noted that their doctrine actually calls in more than 20 places for doing that. Would you talk a little bit about what Americans themselves have at stake in this thing, not just their friends and allies and interests overseas, but we here at home, and how that ought to be factored into this debate as well?
And we ought to factor, I mean, there are a lot of things I didn't have time to discuss. I'll mention two others quickly and then get to that. The Iranians are directly responsible for the deaths of several hundred American soldiers in Iraq. General Odierno showed me on the table in his office when we were near Baghdad, when he and Petraeus were there. We had a meeting with both of them, and Odierno said, "Let me show you this stuff." And I can't read Farsi, but he said, "This is what it says," and it's basically made in Iran, and it's all of these really sophisticated explosive devices that were responsible for a lot of American deaths. They were made in Iran, and they were smuggled across the border by Iranians, and there were Iranian agents who helped to get in place. They killed Americans in the war. They're holding Americans now. There's some publicity about that. We know what they did at the end of the Carter administration. So this is a country that has directly taken action against Americans and has killed Americans, been responsible for the deaths of Americans. And there are other threats, other than through their proxies, that could endanger our lives. And the threat of electromagnetic pulse is a physical reality. I mean, it is a real thing. If you detonate a type of device, nuclear device, at a certain altitude, the kinds of radiation that are emitted, depending again on what kind of device it is, can literally fry electronic devices. It can fry things like the electric grid. And again, it depends on what they are. Look, there are other countries that have actually developed very sophisticated weapons to accomplish exactly this. They are in their arsenals. We're prohibited from doing so. We could launch a nuclear weapon and explode it in space, and it would achieve some result, because that's just the nature of nuclear weapons. But there are weapons designed specifically for this purpose of frying electronics. And think about it. There is nothing that can happen if electronics are frozen. You can't get water. Water is pumped. The pumps run on electricity. You can't get gasoline. Gasoline is pumped. It runs on electricity. You can't do anything without electricity. And if it's not the grids themselves, it's the switching stations, it's the computerization that does this. Not to mention all the things that we use that are electronic. So it's a physical reality. By the way, the sun can do this too. Fortunately, we've had some close calls, but it hasn't been sufficiently direct to actually cause huge outages. The Iranians are believed to have actually tested at least one such device from a barge in the Caspian Sea. The point of that is that you could put a device on any kind of tramp steamer and run it across the Atlantic, and sit off the coast of North Carolina or New York or someplace, and you don't have to be accurate, you don't have to be good, all you got to do is get it up into the air and have it detonated at a certain prescribed altitude, and that then creates the condition. So the question is, well, that's kind of far-fetched. When would they ever do that? We would respond by bombing them into the Stone Age. Well, stop to think about it for a moment. All of a sudden, the stock market goes down, United Airlines reservation system goes down, and a couple other bad things happen, and nobody can quite figure it out. And a few hours later, somebody in the Pentagon does figure it out, and they go to the president. What does he disclose, and what do they do? All they know is there was a big electromagnetic burst. They then check the satellites. Who was out there at the time? Well, we have this tramp steamer with a Panamanian flag with a crew of whatever. And maybe eventually, in a few days, they go out there and they pick them up and they figure out that, well, these guys may not be Iranians. They're too smart for that. Somebody's got the phone number of the Ayatollah in his pocket or something. So they figure out that this probably came from Iran. So, do you kill all Iranians with 3 well-placed nuclear weapons? If you're Barack Obama, especially? No. I mean, any president would have a tough time with this. So by the time you verify it, by the time you think you're good enough to convince the world that you can persuade them that this is what happens, some time has passed, and of course there's big plausible deniability, and everybody is urging caution. The United Nations passes a resolution and says, now let's not be hasty. And of course 99.9% of the Iranians had nothing to do with it. So these are tough questions. It could be used, is the bottom line. Now, by the way, the folks in the electric utility industry will say, well, that's actually not the biggest threat. There are other threats, and they begin with cyber.
Richard, could you get a mic here, please? We're on the record, I think, so if you would identify yourself, please, I'd appreciate it.
I'm Richard Hellman of CPAC and Merkel. Senator Kyl, I appreciate that you're continuing your splendid work to defend America and defend our allies, as you did during your long career in the Senate. And I want to ask what you would think of the Senate asserting its, and the House, the Congress asserting itself as the co-equal foreign policy making body, and in more imaginative and forceful ways, for example, as the House once did in passing H-Con Res 21 to charge Ahmadinejad with incitement to genocide, which caused a little tremor in the force in Tehran, and then your work to put the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. Perhaps people think that's a small or a minor thing, but I think it would send a signal that we're strong enough and well thought of enough and respected enough that we can do what we want to do that is legitimate and legal for our friends. But just a thought, the Congress asserting itself creatively.
And there are a lot of members of Congress that would like to do that. I know it's a bit of a dodge to say, but it's hard to do. But let me just explain a couple of reasons why it's not as easy as some of the folks on talk shows make it sound. First of all, for it to be law, the president does need to sign it. Now, we got a president to sign the Jerusalem Embassy Act with a big fat waiver in it. And that waiver has been exercised every 6 months ever since we got it passed. That's why it's not designated as the embassy. I mean, Jerusalem, not as the place for the U.S. Embassy. A lot of this can be done in appropriation bills, but you have to get them to the floor, and you have to get the president to sign them. And of course, right now, the party out of power is not about to let any appropriation bills to the Senate floor because, God forbid, we would use phony money in the form of OCO spending to the tune of $38 billion to make up for the cap on spending under the Budget Control Act. So it is not easy for Congress to use the power of the purse, even though it has that authority to a large extent. But that doesn't stop Congress from frequently doing some pretty important things in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, in certain appropriation bills. And I think sometimes we don't give our friends in Congress enough credit for the smart, careful, and maybe relatively small but pretty darn important things that they get in these bills from time to time. I'll just give you one example. Frankly, some of this you don't want to talk about until after it's done. But one of my former staffers, a very smart guy, said, why don't we try to get in the NDAA a study, just a study, that would set out the requirements for the strategic nuclear policy of the United States to be effective, and with certain requirements on that. Well, this study was done, and we fixed, who was going to do the study and all. The study came back with some huge fixes that had to be made to the strategic nuclear posture of the U.S. We used that as the negotiating position on the New START. We said, this is the fact, this is the congressionally mandated study. Oh, we didn't know it was in the bill. Well, it was in the bill, and here's the result of it. And these are all experts, and you can't refute them. And frankly, the people in the Department of Energy and Pentagon were shaking their head, yeah, that's true. And so the administration had to buy into all of that. And even though it's violated some of it, at least it formed the basis for a major turnaround in our strategic nuclear posture. So there have been a lot of things, they don't seem that big at the time, but we've got some very good staffers who are able to effectuate this, and some of it you can't talk about. And some of the big stuff that's noisy doesn't get adopted anyway. But yes, there are plenty of people in the House and Senate both that want to reassert Congress's authority to the extent possible.
Yes, sir. Mike?
John, oh, yes, thanks. I'm John Meyer, and I want to ask if there isn't another weapon that could be used against both Russia and Iran. Both of them have a serious nationalities problem. In fact, it brought down the Soviet Empire as much as anything else. Iran is only 50% core Iranian. They've got Azeris, they've got Kurds, they've got a number of other minorities. These are inimical regimes. In addition to the stronger public diplomacy, which I would throw money at, that we really ought to do, can't we start a program of stirring up trouble inside Iran and inside Russia until they make a big U-turn in their policy? That would really sap the strength of these regimes.
When you begin any campaign, whether it's a political campaign or an international diplomatic campaign, you assess your strengths and weaknesses, your assets, your liabilities. Where are the vulnerable points of the adversary? You've identified a well-known vulnerability with respect to both of these regimes. And yes, there are ways to affect it, which are obviously on your mind. I won't say it's not that hard to do, but it has been done and it can be done. We've eliminated many of the tools that we used to have to do those kinds of things. A lot of it's covert, and you have to have a president that's willing to do it. And that goes hand in hand with public diplomacy. It's a part of public diplomacy. And there was a day when we were pretty good at doing those kind of things. And by the way, the Russians are engaged in exactly that in Europe today. They're funding all kinds of activities that are designed to undercut the support for governments in Western Europe with various programs and organizations that can undercut the authority of the governments.
Yes, sir. Up.
Michael Soblik, Senator Cruz's office. Thank you so much, Senator Kyl, for speaking with us today. I wanted to take this idea of messaging that you talked about with Iran and apply it to missile defense. My boss was working on this NDAA, and we introduced an amendment on space-based missile defense, and we noticed in our research that you corresponded with Missile Defense Agency I want to say back in 2011, on an IDA study that had a lot of very interesting and encouraging findings on space-based platforms and intercept capability. And the issue that we ran into, and I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, sir, but when we brought this up in committee, the pushback from the other side was exactly what you just said in your opening remarks about weaponizing space. And I wonder if you have any thoughts for members of Congress who are continuing this push now. Is there a messaging tweak that we could utilize to try to change the debate, or any thoughts you may have on that subject? Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for your interest in it. The best missile defense is a defense that, in coordination with some sea and land-based assets, is located in space. It is the cheapest, it is the most effective, it's the best. And the Russians and the Chinese know that, which is why they're so apoplectic about allowing the U.S. to have anything close to that capability. And when you have an administration that's trying to please them, naturally the administration won't allow that to happen. So we tried to get a paltry, I think, $5 million for a study of situational awareness. But going all the way back to Hank Cooper and before, there's no question that a small space-based contingent of satellites gives you the best opportunity, because you get the opposition in the ascent phase of the offensive missile. We have to be willing to make the argument. If it is a question of millions of American lives at stake, what's wrong with the defense in space? We have airplanes in space. Well, they're not quite at the same altitude. So we're going to let everything below 65,000 feet is okay, but above 65,000 feet is not, or whatever. What's the policy? What's the limiting principle here? What's the rationale? What's the distinction? And the reality is that an offensive missile flies through space. That's militarization of space. Why can't you have a defense in space, therefore? Isn't that more moral, as Ronald Reagan says? A lot of good arguments on it, and we ought to focus a lot more on that. It is futile in this administration, and yet sometimes you got enough fights that you don't want to start fights that you know you can't win. But you try to keep things alive, and that's why we were trying to keep that with that study, to keep it alive. But we've got to return to it. It has to form part of our defense, because the Chinese and the Russians are very much engaged in that. And with the advent of excuse me, cyber warfare and other kinds of signals warfare, you're in space no matter what. You've got to protect your satellites. You've got to have a way to deal with the other guy's satellites. This is now a fact. We ought to be beyond arguing about this artificial constraint.
Could I just emphasize the point that Senator Kyl just made, that the thing that's really different, even from 2011, is the now obvious evidence of the Russians and Chinese both militarizing space in a very offensive way, not defensive. Michael? Mike, down here, please.
Well, and defensive in the sense that they both, but particularly the Chinese, have actually launched, yeah, thank you, have actually launched from aircraft missiles to destroy satellites in space. I mean, and we have that, at least it is alleged that we may have that same capability. So who's kidding who?
Right. Exactly. Michael?
Michael Hain, Alliance for Vigilance. Looking a couple of moves ahead, if Israel should attack Iran to delay their nuclear program until hopefully that we have a different president in office, do you consider that the U.S. would be at risk? And if so, could you summarize briefly what you would consider to be the major threats we face?
I think there's some other experts that would be able to address that with much more intelligence than I can. I haven't had the benefit of briefings, intelligence briefings recently, and a lot of that gets into some pretty classified stuff. It would be very useful for you to have somebody who could actually talk about that to tell you. There's a lot of speculation about what happens in that event. Is it really in the Iranians? You know, I talked before about how difficult it is for an American president to respond to, let's say, an EMP kind of attack with a nuclear weapon. Well, is it in the interest of the Iranians to respond to such an attack, and if so, how much? Part of that is the calculus of how much blowback there would be to their response. And these things have been war gamed, I guarantee you, by the Israelis, and I'm sure by the Pentagon. And I'm sure there's somebody knowledgeable that would be able to really run through all the scenarios in a very smart way, much better than I could just by doing it here today. But of course, part of the calculus of taking military action is what is the response and then what's the reply to the response.
Go ahead. Nope. One, two more down, sorry. Jeff, we'll get back to you.
Jeff Dowby, ZOA Israel. Since I'm based in Jerusalem, Senator, I have the privileged opportunity to speak very often to policy wonks, military experts there. My question relates directly to the previous gentleman's question. The preponderance of opinion in Israel is that if the S-300 system is deployed and made operational, that will compel Israel to take certain steps. Can you help us understand, and I'd love to take back your counsel to the Knesset and to various other leadership in Israel, what we should do exactly, what will be the nature of the diplomatic blowback, should we do in case the UN Security Council passes a Chapter 7 resolution and the Obama administration fails to veto that?
This is a really important question, and I'll speak partially to it. This weapon system is one that the Russians had sold to Iran a long time ago, but had, at our request, not delivered. And eventually they decided to deliver it. And the response from the State Department was so pathetic, it was hard to believe. Well, you know, they paid for them, and so they have a right to send the missiles over that the Iranians paid for. Well, of course, they have a right to do it. They have a right to sell the Iranians anything they want to, I suppose, in the way of weaponry. But the installation of those defensive missiles will so alter with respect to an attack on Iran that it is a fundamental change, a fundamental shift in the military equation there. These are not just average run-of-the-mill anti-aircraft missiles, though they are that. They are a highly sophisticated radar system, communication system, and hot missile that has capabilities both against missiles and aircraft, and would be challenging for the United States, let alone a country with slightly less capability than the United States, namely Israel. I can't get into, and again, I'm not burdened by recent intelligence briefings on this, so I can't really say what the latest evaluations are. But what I can say that this has been underreported, it's understood. People need to appreciate the degree to which this could change the whole equation, even to the point of being an important factor in a country like Israel deciding whether or not it had to launch a preemptive attack before this system became operational. It's that effective. It's that problematic for the Israelis. And it will clearly be a factor in the Israeli government's decision-making. How big of a factor and so on, I obviously cannot say.
Did you want to address the question of diplomatic blowback if Israel decides to do something about this? Or were you deliberately not responding to that part of the question?
Well, I don't know. You could have a whole lunch talk on. Let's go through a couple. Let's war game a couple scenarios. What might happen? In fact, it'd be an interesting exercise because these are not easy questions. You know, the Prime Minister of Israel is going to have to figure out, okay, which Israeli city is going to be hit, and how many casualties is that going to be? Maybe. What would we have to do to try to obviate that? What would our response be, and against whom in Iran? We can target all their military facilities, okay? So then they launch, let's say, 2 missiles, one at Tel Aviv and one at Haifa, let's say. What is our response to that? And so you get into just an awful lot of what-ifs, and it's all been war-gamed. I've not been privy to all of those recently, and so I would encourage, it's a really interesting exercise to go through. It makes you stop and think. You know, one thing we should realize, many of us in this room here are public advocates. We're in the middle of the debate, and we tend to and we're required by media constraints and so on to be fairly concise in what we say, and we sometimes summarize things in ways that are generally correct but not totally accurate. We need to be careful about how we discuss all of these really important things. They are complicated, they're difficult. The answers are not always easy and certainly not black and white. We always need to think about being not just nuanced, but careful in the way we discuss things.
Jeff?
Jeff Kennedy with Council for America. You provided some interesting insights earlier on what you call this false dilemma of whether we either have this agreement or we have war. It seems like there's another false dilemma that's growing up in this whole debate, and that is either we have this agreement in which Iran will develop nuclear weapons, but it'll take place longer, and if we, in absence of the agreement, they'll have weapons even sooner. How would you deal with that particular problem?
Well, the way I deal with it is by saying, so you're just going to give up on any other way of influencing Iran's behavior? In other words, what that would admit is, yes, we're willing to take a bad deal because we don't see any other alternative. There has to be another alternative. What I was saying is that those of us who have to be willing to walk away from the table, look, if we're not willing to walk away from the table, and even Jon Kyl has been saying recently that he is willing to do so, whether he is or not, I don't know. But if you're not willing to walk away, you're in a horrible position, negotiating position. The other side at least has to think you're willing to walk away, and you probably should be willing to walk away. So then what's your plan B? And plan B could consist, you don't necessarily have to get to plan C all at once, military action. What you might do is work a sanction regime that is doable with your allies, but that has a greater degree of potential for success, which is the one that I talked about. So we have to understand what our plan B is and be able to articulate it, not let the president get away with the notion that his is the only alternative.
Take one over here, Dan.
Dan Pollock, you talked about the mechanism to override the president's veto. In retrospect, if you had been in the Senate, would we have had a different way of fighting against the administration that would have, an attempt was made to amend Corker-Cardin to require it to be treated as a treaty, and that failed the Senate. And, we have to admit that many of our friends whose hearts are in the right place ended up voting to establish the very criteria that is likely to be problematic in the next few weeks. Was there another way?
I would have argued for a different approach. Remember the constraints they were operating under. The president said, I'm going to do this, period. Congress said, whoa, we have a role here too. He said, well, I'm going to do it no matter what. And so to some extent they were dealing with sort of a fait accompli. Now, what they had on their side was a lot of public opinion, and I would say a valid case to be made that the president shouldn't be able to exercise this power. But in terms of raw exercise of power, it's not something that the Supreme Court's going to throw out. You never get it before the court. So the question is, well, what can Congress salvage from this? Again, I would have argued for a much stronger proposition. I don't know whether I could have succeeded.
Red lights?
By the way, can I just mention, we have to be careful about this argument too. Because remember when President Bush was in authority, we were pretty strong on executive power. And remember when we did the deal that, under the first President Bush, when we decided after the wall came down and the Soviet Union came apart, that we didn't need to maintain quite the size of the nuclear arsenal that we had. And we said, so we're going to eliminate, or we're going to take some of our weapons down. And the Russians said, well, we need a treaty for that. And we said, no, we don't. We just don't choose to have as many weapons as we have. We don't care how many you have. If you think you can afford to keep all those, be our guest. But we're going to draw some of ours down. At least I was one who supported that. And I supported the president being able to do that without congressional authority. Well, in terms of appropriations for how much we were going to spend on maintaining the force and all of that, there was some authority there from Congress. But it didn't have to be a treaty with the Russians. And eventually the Russians said, well, couldn't we please have a treaty? Just even a couple of pages that bears out what you're going to do. And we said, okay. So we basically said, here's what we're going to do. Do you want to sign up to that? And they said, yeah. So there was an agreement. Was it ever voted on as a treaty? I don't I think it was. I don't think it was. So my point is that there are some things that you can do as a president that don't require the treaty approval, by the Senate. But on something this significant, and the president is making as significant as it is, you surely get into that high-altitude realm of things that ought to be the subject of Senate consideration.
Senator, when you were on the Hill, 6 UN Security Council resolutions were passed calling on Iran to stop enriching uranium. Now we have an agreement where Iran will continue to enrich uranium and develop advanced centrifuges. Do you think it is possible to have a meaningful agreement with Iran that allows it to continue to enrich uranium?
No, and that's one of the points that is made in the 9-point memorandum that Frank et al. With Center for Security Policy prepared.
You don't see any verification regime, because that's what the administration is arguing. Well, we'll verify that this enrichment won't be used for weapons.
Yeah, good luck. And as I said, suppose you could verify it. How are you going to enforce it? You find that you have intelligence that is not conclusive, because no intelligence ever is. Yeah, right. Yeah, it's a slam dunk. I'm sorry. Bring back George Tenet, but no, I go back to what I said before. I don't need to add to it.
Good. Shelley?
When you were talking, your talking point about whether to enforce or withdraw sanctions, you mentioned that you would be able to communicate with the people there to understand that you were going to put pressure on the Ayatollah and were not necessarily desiring to make their lives miserable. What kind of communication method are you developing? I mean, is it dropping flyers and food packets in Farsi? What are you proposing?
No, I'm not proposing anything particularly. I'm trying to conceptualize how we could make sanctions, how we could defend stronger sanctions and get approval from our allies who are necessary to help us make them work, and B, to actually have them be effective. And I think that they could be more effective if they tried to change the behavior of the Iranian government, not just stop them from acquiring a nuclear weapon. The people don't care about that. They do care about suffering economically. So how can you get them on your side? That's the big fear of the Ayatollahs, to have the people be revolting against them. So take advantage of the weakness, but one of the things pointed out before, the fear of the regime that the people could rise up, and sanctions could be used to effectuate that, rather than the way that it's being used now. It actually exacerbates the PR problem from my point. I mean, it turns us into the enemy rather than the Ayatollahs. So I don't have a plan. I'm not developing legislation. I haven't figured out what kind of balloons to drop. But there are plenty of ways to communicate that if you want to get the message across. It is hard for them. The Iranians have developed pretty sophisticated device and public communication methodologies. So, the new technologies that Iranians use just as much as we do are not totally available, but there are ways, I think, to reach the people.
Well, I think the emphasis that you've placed on getting back in the business of trying to do influencing is really well placed, Senator, and I'm sorry to see that that's just not seemingly appreciated either by the administration or your colleagues on the Hill at the moment.
In order to engage in that, you have to believe in what you're doing.
You do. Theology, actually. Right.
The Security Council there's a thing going around today by Amri Saran, for example, from TIP, that in response to the demand that ballistic missiles be considered, that they will incorporate that in a very nebulous way into a Security Council resolution, which will actually be meaningless, as you said, will have no true enforcement capabilities, and then that will be tied to an actual diminution of the existing Security Council prohibition on Iran's importing of weapons. So a timetable to remove the importation of Iranian weapons to make it possible for Russia to export an ever-growing number of systems to Iran. So there's an additional danger in the Security Council action, in addition to the problem of the Security Council enforcement mechanisms can't be better than they are. By nature, China and Russia get the veto on anything the Security Council does. So we have to be very careful there. But politically, it can sound good, but actually be something that we need the House and Senate to point out as they oppose this agreement, that those Security Council actions must be not done in the vacuum. And the President does have the power to vote for and propose whatever Security Council resolutions they want. But it can all be done in sunshine, and that's the only weapon we have here. I hope I added something there.
Senator, any thoughts on that? I do need to make one correction. Senator, apparently back in 2003, the Senate did vote unanimously for the Treaty of Moscow, which codified those unilateral arrangements. You want to speak?
The Treaty of Moscow, but I don't think, but I don't think it was a full treaty. Now you remind me, it was the Treaty of Moscow. Was it a full treaty?
I think so. I think it was considered a treaty, but it was considered obviously not a controversial treaty.
Well, right.
As a result,
And in
it
any
enjoyed that
event, the
support.
point we're trying to illustrate was sometimes we believe the United States and the President has the ability to make unilateral decisions in this regard. It was clearly something that he had strong public support to do, and if it was in fact voted on, that was, I think, in my view, that probably was unnecessary, but it was probably prudent because it demonstrates that you have a consensus, and that's always a better proposition if you can demonstrate that you've got the Congress with you.
Right. I just want to close with one observation, if I can, and it kind of picks up on the points that were just bandied about. This seems to me, as I discussed with Senator Kyl earlier, to be a really epical moment for our country on this deal with Iran, for reasons that have been discussed now at length today and will be going forward in even greater detail. These don't happen very often. And I'm reminded of a period back in the late 1970s when we were facing a similar kind of disaster in terms of American policy, foreign policy, national security policy, the hollowing out of the military, the Carter administration's conduct of national security affairs. And there was a defining debate, really, that I recall well, the Panama Canal Treaty debate. And in the end, the position that we should not surrender sovereign control of the Panama Canal did not prevail. But it really did hone the issue for the election that followed shortly thereafter, and I think ultimately resulted not only in someone who vehemently disagreed with that surrender, as he called it, but who also offered the American people a very different choice, not only to become the president, but also to get a mandate for that different approach. And I couldn't agree more with what Senator Kyl here has said about the need to get onto a different track. We appreciate tremendously, Senator, your joining us to talk about the need for that. And I'm hoping that this debate on the Iran deal, win, lose, or draw, will serve as a defining moment, as I say, that puts us on a different trajectory. So with your leadership, especially, we look forward to that coming about. Would you join me, please, in thanking Senator Kyl?